Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 6th of February. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
And Craig, this week we welcome for the first time viewers from WTV in Perth. So welcome to those viewers. On this week's CEC Report, what do the Queensland election and Abbott leadership crisis prove? It's the economy, stupid. And Sydney siege inquest must investigate ASIO's role. So first, what do the Queensland election and Abbott leadership crisis prove? It's the economy, stupid. Craig, this was quite a stunning election result last week in Queensland, but I must say, it's stunning in one sense, it's almost becoming normal in another sense, right? We are used to this kind of turmoil in Australian politics at the moment.
I think this is going to be the norm from now on, Robbie. These one-term elections like you've had in Queensland are the same as what you've had in Victoria, and you're going to see the same phenomenon happen time and time again, because you can't actually run a country based upon the existing policies. And that's now, we've had 30 to 40 years of the policies of economic rationalism, of privatisation, free trade, globalisation being rammed down the throats of Australians, and as such, we've lost industry, we've sold industries overseas, we've become one big hole in the ground in many cases, and consequently our economy has shrunk to the point that now we're going to be buffeted by these various forces. Like unemployment is one thing, and so forth. And what you're going to see are people going to say, well, this is not what I want, and there's going to be a lot of turmoil.
Because we're in a period, and it's been that way for quite a long time, Craig. Governments do not get voted in Australia; they get voted out. But of course, the incoming government claims they got some kind of a mandate. All they got a mandate to do is not what the previous ones did, but what they all have is an ideology that unfortunately and tragically, in most cases, Labor shares since the Hawke-Keating era. It's a monetarist, as you said, economic rationalist ideology. So they come in with this ideology to solve problems. And take the case of Queensland, what the biggest single issue upon which people voted out the Newman government is the same issue they voted out the previous Labor government, i.e. privatisation. They hate it, right? So Labor in Queensland at the moment, because there was such a small rump in the parliament, I suspect they knew they had no choice but to be like old Labor and not tolerate privatisation at all. They seemingly learnt their lesson, but we'll see how they go in government. But for the Liberals not to have learnt that is the height of stupidity. The voters aren't tolerating it. And privatisation is one of these policies that comes under the broad umbrella of austerity, right? Where this is the ideology that comes in when they look at the dry numbers on the books and say, oh, we've got a deficit, we've got to slash and burn. And of course, at a time when you've got a massive inequality gap, the rich are getting richer, but the industrial economy is collapsing, etc. The burden falls on ordinary people who are already suffering an intolerable burden with the cost of living crisis, the cost of housing, all those types of things, and the people are reacting in a serious way.
I think, Robbie, come back to 1996, because what people don't seem to realise is that these policies, economic rationalism, of privatisation, free trade and so forth, free trade is not a new policy, right? Because you've had British free trade with the British Empire for hundreds of years. But the real influx came back in the 1996 period, in the 1970s, with the development of a whole series of these think tanks spurned by an organisation called the Mont Pelerin Society. In 1996, we unearthed this organisation and how it actually spurned off things like the Centre for Independent Studies, the Tasman Institute, the Institute for Economic Affairs, was its mother, and you had all these other institutes, which we go through in the flow chart that's actually on the screen now, to show that this policy it's actually only been live since the 70s. And this is what's leading to this volatility now. The sell-off of private assets is one of the most hated policies across Australia, and the Abbott government's walking straight into this firestorm as well.
No, exactly. And I want to talk about Abbott now, but just to set the scene, one of the things that, even though we're talking about this, Craig, this sense of economic crisis in the community is not officially acknowledged. The media doesn't talk about it. The politicians certainly don't talk about it. Abbott and Hockey will talk about the debt and deficit disaster.
That's because, Robbie, they can't challenge the entire system.
Exactly.
And the entire system is what's causing the problem. What you're seeing in Greece now is a movement to turn over the entire system.
And that's what I was going to say. We have our own taste of Greece, but it's not getting reported that way because we're supposedly the best economy in the world. When, well, that may be true, but when the rest of the world is a steaming pile of crisis, you know, to be the best is sort of relative. But that's not true because countries like, you know, China and other countries that actually build infrastructure to physically raise living standards are in a much better position than we are.
Well, right now, Robbie, they just completed meetings between China, Russia and India. And the discussions between these countries are phenomenal. The amount of cooperation between these countries is something that's not reported in the West at all.
Yep.
But I mean, back in December, you know, China launched about another 3,000 kilometres of high-speed rail, taking its total high-speed rail to something like 15,000 kilometres, right? Now, how much high-speed rail have we got in this country? There's a measure, for example, of the sort of commitment there is to real infrastructure.
Yep. A nation-building vision that we don't have. And just a predicate I thought is worth highlighting about the Abbott government, because the soap opera drama this week, you know, viewers will know that all of a sudden, after Abbott knighted the prince and everything else that went with that, he's in deep trouble, as he should be. But anyway, it's such a deja vu for the Gillard-Rudd years, it's incredible, right? And this is only 14 or 15 months into Abbott's term. But the thing that got me the most was in the National Press Club address that Abbott gave this week. In response to a question, he singled out the media and told them how they should be reporting, right? He said, you shouldn't report the soap opera, you should report what we're doing. And it was precisely the same message that Julia Gillard famously gave the media at the same National Press Club when she was Prime Minister, when she famously said, don't write crap, right? So, and everything is precisely the same, it's just the party labels are changed at the moment. And you think, well, how can that be that way so quickly? Well, because of this question of economic crisis, it isn't acknowledged. So how bad is the economy? There was something happened this week that, Craig, on the surface, people will think, oh, that's good. But you take a step back and you think about the decision making that led to it, and you realise, oh my God, that is an alarm bell. And the decision was the Reserve Bank's decision to cut interest rates. Now, interest rates are now 2.25%. Let me explain an economic concept to viewers called the real interest rate. What they call the real interest rate is the official interest rate minus the official inflation rate. Australia's inflation rate at the moment is roughly 2.2 to 2.4%, something around that. So in other words, the real interest rate in Australia right now is effectively zero. The Reserve Bank has cut interest rates, real interest rates, to effectively zero. In 2008, early 2009, when the global financial crisis was red hot, and people will remember that, right? There was an undeniable sense of crisis then. Interest rates got down to 3%. And at that time, the then Treasurer, Wayne Swan, said that was emergency levels, 3%. We seemingly don't have a crisis at the moment, Craig, or an emergency, but the interest rate is 0.75% lower now than the emergency levels then. That tells you that there are people in decision-making positions who know we do have a crisis.
Well, Robbie, if you go back and look at history again, go back to the 1930s, the biggest single problem that they had in the economy then, which was trying to be dealt with by the likes of Ted Theodore, was this issue of deflation.
Yep.
Now, we haven't heard, most people don't know what deflation is, but that is the process of where prices start to fall. And why do prices start to fall? Is because people can't afford, because of the circumstances. At that time, you had up to 30% unemployment, because of the fact
there's
that
no actual market demand.
There's no demand.
No one's got any money.
So prices can fall, right? That means that companies, to try and survive, sell off their inventories, right? And this means that there's no profits coming in to keep employing people. So what we're getting into here is a period of not just zero interest rates, potentially deflation, as a measure of the degree of unemployment and of the lack of growth in the real economy. And this is what's really, really serious here, because as soon as you go, the solution is not that difficult, actually. You have to go with large-scale infrastructure development projects funded through national credit.
And you're talking about government action, not some kind of market mechanism. What can the government do?
Well, look, we've got numerous economic development projects that we can develop straight away in this country. We put out a blueprint for this back in 2002, where we actually, in the front of that paper, the head of that New Citizen newspaper was economic fascist austerity or economic development for Australia. That was the nature of the policy back then that we were trying to promote. Now, by funding large-scale infrastructure, you put large numbers of people into well-paying jobs. You don't fund this, though, by going to the boardrooms of the banks and the private companies and say, we want to grease your pockets. We want to line your pockets and grease your palms. No, we want to create the credit through what we call a national bank, like the Commonwealth Bank of past. You create the credit and you spend it into the economy, into real physical economic development in large-scale infrastructure development projects, water projects, high-speed rail, energy projects.
And you don't just create jobs in the construction, you're talking about the steel industry gets revived to provide the steel, and the concrete industry expands to provide the concrete.
But it has to be government directed, right? So if you build a magnetic levitation train system, for example, between Sydney and Melbourne, or what about Perth?
Let's include Perth in these infrastructure projects, Craig.
Right? So you've got concrete industries, you've got steel industries, you've got the technologies associated with that, the rolling stock, more power stations, you've got sidings to build and so forth, if it's freight, and you've got passenger terminals and so forth to build. This will create jobs.
Yep.
And it's going to take a while to pay it off if it's a very low interest rate, but who cares? If you expand the economy because you're spending money into it in providing the backbone type infrastructure that's necessary, then you'll
but because the economy grows, you're effectively paying it off as you go. Well, look, we've covered that subject. We actually have run out of time. When we come back, we're going to talk about something very serious, which is the current inquest into the siege in Sydney. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Sydney siege inquest must investigate ASIO's role. So Craig, we're now going to raise a very serious subject, which is the potential role that ASIO, Australia's spy agency that most people would have no clue how it really operates, might have played and probably did play in the terrorist siege in Sydney on the 15th of December at Martin Place. Now, let me just say that by the time people see this, in general terms, unless they've watched it straight away on YouTube, the shows on 60 Minutes and Channel 7 will have aired on Sunday night. I'm sure it'll be very emotional, right? And as completely understandably. The problem is people can't let the emotion of it cloud the determination we should have to actually see what really did happen, right? And so this is not in any way to undermine what the victims went through. It was very real and very serious, but there's a bigger picture here, and that's what we want to raise, and we need to make sure that the spotlight is shone on ASIO so that their role in this doesn't get swept under the carpet. And the reason the other thing I want to say, last week, Craig, the inquest began. Now, it was just one day, and it's kind of strange that it began that way. They haven't announced when they're going to resume again. I get the impression they rushed to have the first day of it, just so that they could have something stated on the record before the shows came out. And incidentally, it's very curious that these shows that we're not hearing from the hostages until nearly 2 months after it happened. Right? If this was America or any other country, you would have heard from them the next day. Right? I'm sorry, you would have. This is the way this has been handled. A lot of stories can be crafted behind the scenes, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what was stated at the inquest that was reported in the press, the way the press reported what was stated at the inquest opening last Thursday is wrong. They reported it as if it was fact. Now, the counsellor for the authorities, the lawyer whose statement was quoted at length, yes, he stated these things as if they were fact, but he qualified it by saying that these are the things that they have to prove in the inquest. So everything he stated that was reported, such as the manner of execution, etc., is all unproven. This has not been confirmed yet by the inquest. They're saying they will prove this in the inquest. Fine, let's see the proof. But people have to understand that, because that's not the way the media reported it. It was as if that's determined, that's fact. because I will point out that straight away that all those things completely contradicted the flurry of reporting that happened in the day or two after the siege ended, right? Where there was it wasn't about an execution. People were saying it was more a struggle over a gun, all these types of things. So we have to see how that goes. There are people in high places who, because of the controversial nature of this, there will be an attempt to cover certain things up. And I will say, I've got a quote here from the media. Now, these are paid stories that they're doing with the hostages. That gives the media control over what they say. The hostages have to sign a confidentiality agreement, which includes exclusivity. So the media, Channel 9 and Channel 7, get to determine what goes to air. The Sydney Morning Herald on the 23rd of January quoted, this is a quote from the Sydney Morning Herald, Channels 9 and 7 have both reportedly secured paid interviews with hostages. 9 says it is working with police to ensure its broadcast is accurate. So working with police to ensure its broadcast is accurate. Now, I'll just finish the quote. 7 says it would never wish to interfere with an official inquiry. End quote. I'm sorry, but the police role in this is part of the inquiry, right? They are also under inquiry. That's for Channel 9 to say that is very revealing quite there. And here's the final thing about the way this investigation part is being handled. The government has announced that because there's questions over the way the police handled it, they have appointed a body that can basically score the handling of the siege. And this body comes from Britain. They brought in a British group to do an examination of how the police handled the scene. That is a surefire recipe for a cover-up, because on the 25th of September 2014, we, the CEC, issued a release that said British SIS/MI5 planning a terrorist attack on Australia, ? And what we pointed out in that is that ASIO is a subsidiary, has always functioned as virtually a subsidiary of British MI5, right? And there's an orchestration element here where when an attack happens, and even when there's just warnings of an attack happening, ASIO, this largely unaccountable organisation that's a secret police force, gets more and more and more powers over our everyday lives in ways that we don't even know about. And when 9/11 happened, and all this started with the Homeland Security Act in the United States and extra powers for ASIO and that here, Craig, people thought, 9/11, yes, it's justified. But we're now more than, we're 13 and 14 years after that. We now know, thanks to whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and those guys, we know about the surveillance operation that is all-encompassing through the National Security Agency, that Australia is part of the Five Eyes Agreement with Britain, the United States, New Zealand, Canada and us. And we have this enormous public surveillance apparatus that's completely unaccountable, right? And this has become a fascist police state, and these incidents give them more powers, right? And there is a vested interest here, and that's why it has to be examined in an impartial way, a properly impartial way. Now, sorry I took all that. We better take a break. When we come back, we're just going to give some specifics of why we're zeroing in on ASIO in this case. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing how the Sydney Siege Inquest must investigate ASIO's role. So, Craig, the information about ASIO that has to be investigated is that there's an Australian who's come forward with direct knowledge that ASIO had an extensive dealings with the hostage taker, man Haron Monis. He was not some lone wolf that just emerged out of the blue. He was very well known to ASIO. They had dealings with him going back a long way. Now, this information has come from this man. I'll just hold up his book. This is Mamdouh Habib. Now, Mamdouh Habib is one of 2 Australians who was detained at Guantanamo Bay. Now, before you think, that means he's a terrorist, no, it's proved he wasn't a terrorist. He was never charged. He was certainly never convicted because he was never charged. And he has had a 20-year interaction with ASIO. For 20 years, this man was harassed by ASIO, long before September 11 and all that stuff happened, which is why he got picked up overseas because he was already a target of ASIO. He was picked up straight away as soon as the September 11 attack happened. And everything, he was tortured in Egypt. He was renditioned to Egypt and tortured, actually tortured. Now, you might think, oh, well, that's what the Egyptians do. He was tortured with the full knowledge and complicity of the Australian government. And this, he claimed this all along. In 2011, this was confirmed. An Egyptian official came forward and admitted that Habib was there, he was tortured, and that Australian authorities, officials from ASIO were present when he was tortured, right? Something that is totally against our law, that Australians would think never happens here. This is documented in his book, My Story, The Tale of a Terrorist Who Wasn't. In 2007, Habib was running for, he'd been released from Guantanamo Bay in 2005, back in Australia in 2007 he ran as an independent for Parliament, and that's when he met Monis, Manharon Monis. Now Manharon Monis, you've seen him on TV, he was a grandstander, he was an attention seeker, he was all kinds of things. He was one of the people who went to Habib and said, I want to help on your campaign. Habib and Monis used to talk a lot, and what they talked about was ASIO because of their shared experience. Habib knew his experience with ASIO, and Monis would tell Habib about his experiences with ASIO, right? To the point where at one stage, Habib quotes Monis saying to him about his attention from ASIO, I'm sick and tired of this. Now, so that is established. And what that means is, by at least the middle of the day, like the middle of the afternoon, on the day of the Sydney siege, Monis's identity was known. The minute his identity was known, the authorities would have known they're dealing with an attention seeker and a grandstander. ASIO was definitely involved in the decision making at the time. We're asking the question, was ASIO calling the shots? ASIO knew this man intimately, and something else, Craig, would have been known about him, which is that what really flipped him over is nothing to do with ISIS and all the decorative stuff he claimed. In October, Monis was cut off having any phone contact with his two sons. Now, they're about 10 and 11 or something like that. So he was cut off from that, not to have any more phone contact. This sent him nuts, like, you know, using that term loosely. And that, Habib suspects that made him snap. The point is, that was known, right? Why did, therefore, the authorities on that day, one, turn down the offer of people like Habib, and not just Habib, who when he offered, he said, I know this guy, I can get him out, let me go to the cafe and negotiate. They turned down his offer. They turned down the offer of the Grand Mufti of Australia to negotiate with him, when in a normal hostage situation you want people who he can have a trust with to establish rapport. Not only that, they did not have any communication with Monis for hours at a time, and that is highly unusual. And people outside of us are questioning, hang on, was this being treated purely as a terrorist event under the stupidity of we don't negotiate with terrorists, instead of looking beyond what he's claiming and say, no, this guy is a disturbed person who has these real personal problems, we have to try and get behind that, right?
Just to make a comment here, Robbie, I think it's all come out pretty clearly when Tony Abbott, just this last week, came out and said, we need more laws to deal with this terrorism. This has been the motivation, as we put out in our article, you know, British SIS ASIO planning a terror attack in Australia. This is designed to bring in the sorts of laws to control the population generally, and they're using terrorism, as has happened since 9/11, in order to bring in laws that otherwise wouldn't be established in this country. And that's the story here, and that's actually the motivation.
Read our press release on our website. So thanks for tuning in to the CEC Report. Tune in next week for more of the same.